You know how sometimes a seemingly simple idea just explodes online? Well, that's exactly what's been happening with 50-50 relationships. It sounds fair, right? Split everything down the middle. But this whole debate has turned into a massive digital battleground, and it's pulling back the curtain on some really deep truths about money, work, and gender today. Okay, let's get into it.
And this right here, this is the kind of comment that's just lighting up forums like Reddit. It gets straight to the core of the issue. See, the argument isn't really about who pays for dinner. It's about how we value all the work that goes into a partnership. The stuff we see, and maybe more importantly, the stuff we don't. And that sentiment is clearly hitting a nerve for millions of people. Right, so that brings us to the big question. On the surface, 50-50 seems like the definition of fair. So why is it sparking so much controversy? In this explainer, we're going to unpack exactly why this idea has become so incredibly divisive. We'll look at the tech that's shaping the whole conversation, the history that brought us to this point, and the old-school stereotypes that just won't seem to go away.
All right, so first things first, we have to talk about the places where these debates are actually happening. Because it turns out, the technology isn't just some neutral stage for our arguments. Nope, it's an active player in the game, and it's literally shaping what we see, and a lot of the time, what we end up believing.
The key idea to understand here is the echo chamber. Think about it like this. The algorithms on TikTok, Instagram, you name it, they're designed to give you more of what you already like and agree with. The system figures out what you think, and then it just feeds it right back to you. The result? You see fewer different viewpoints, and your own beliefs, well, they just get stronger and stronger.
And this whole echo chamber thing gets put on steroids when you realize that, as a report from the European Parliament shows, men and women often hang out in completely different corners of the internet. Women tend to gravitate toward platforms like Instagram and TikTok, while men are more likely to be on Reddit or Twitch. This basically creates these huge gender-based echo chambers.
But wait, it goes even deeper. It's not just where we go online, it's what we do when we get there. Research shows that men are more likely to jump online to share their opinions, get into debates. Women, on the other hand, are more likely to use these platforms to keep up with friends and family. And the algorithms, they see all this, they learn from it, and they serve up more content that just reinforces those exact patterns.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second, because this digital divide is actually being fueled by a much, much older imbalance in the real world. The whole 50-50 online fight is really just a new battle in a very old war, a war over what sociologists call the second shift.
To really get what's happening now, we've got to rewind the clock. Data from the Brookings Institution shows just how radically women's roles have changed. Back in the early 1900s, very few married women worked for pay, but by 1970, that number shot up to 40%. This created the two-income family we all know today. But as women headed out to the office, a really important question was left hanging. What happened to all the work they were already doing at home?
Well, this single number tells a huge part of the story. 7 hours. Studies found that when a woman gets married, her weekly load of unpaid work, we're talking chores, childcare, managing the household, goes up by an average of 7 hours. That's an entire extra workday every single week. That, right there, is the second shift.
And this quote from a user on Reddit, it just perfectly captures that frustration. The argument here is that splitting the bills 50-50 feels deeply unfair if you're not also splitting the invisible, unpaid labor 50-50. All that work, the planning, the cleaning, the childcare, it's essential, but it often doesn't make it into the spreadsheet.
So, we've got these long-held patterns about unpaid work. Now let's connect that back to the beginning and see what happens when you take these old-school biases and plug them into our new high-speed technology. Here's the most important takeaway, and it's a big one. The internet doesn't get rid of old stereotypes. In a lot of ways, it's like pouring gasoline on them. A subtle bias that might exist offline can become a loud, overwhelming, and unavoidable narrative online.
And if you need proof, just look at this. It's actually kind of shocking. In a study on TikTok, a totally neutral search for female driver didn't give back neutral results. The platform's algorithm served up videos and comments that actively pushed a really negative stereotype. It's a perfect, small-scale example of how these systems can spread bias automatically and at an incredible speed.
And look, this isn't some random glitch. Academic research confirms that these platforms are reflecting and, in turn, strengthening stereotypes that have been around forever. The idea that men work outside, women manage the home, isn't just floating around in our culture, it gets baked into the media we see every day.
and that shapes the whole argument over what a fair split really is. So, where does all this leave us? Well, it's pretty clear that social media isn't just one thing. When we're talking about gender equality, it is a seriously powerful tool. But it's a tool that can cut both ways. It's a true double-edged sword.
On one side of that sword, you have some genuinely harmful stuff. These platforms host organized misogynistic groups, often called the manosphere, and they make it easier to spread cyberviolence, harassment, and disinformation that specifically targets women. They can create a really hostile online world. And the data on this is just undeniable. Take this study from the pandemic, for example. It found that girls were about twice as likely as boys to be sent unwanted sexual pictures online. It just goes to show you that the experience of just being online can be fundamentally different and way more threatening depending on your gender.
But, and this is so important, that is not the whole story, not even close. Because the very same platforms have been used to build some of the most powerful feminist movements we've ever seen. Think about hashtags like #MeToo, or projects like Everyday Sexism. They've used social media to raise awareness around the entire globe and challenge the exact inequalities we've been talking about.
Which brings us to our final, massive question. This whole 50-50 debate is so much more than an argument about who does the dishes. It's a window into how we're all grappling with technology, with history, and with ourself. The tools we're building have the power to either amplify biases that are thousands of years old, or to help us forge a brand new path toward equality. The real question is, which path are we going to choose?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and hopefully give you some of those aha moments. Today, we're plunging into something huge, really something that affects almost everyone. The complex relationship between gender, social media, and, well, the bigger picture of societal equality. This isn't just about TikTok trends. It's about the deeper currents shaping how we interact, both online and off. Our mission is simple: give you the key takeaways without you having to sift through everything yourself. We've looked at academic studies on TikTok, fire reform debates, EU Parliament reports, some history from Brookings, even Wikipedia for definitions. By the end, you should have a much clearer view of how these forces actually work in everyday life.
Exactly. And we'll be covering quite a bit, how different genders use platforms, the really serious stuff like online discrimination and cyber violence. We'll also link that to economic pressures, relationship dynamics, and importantly, look at how social media is sometimes used for positive change too.
Okay, let's unpack this right away. How do our digital habits actually differ between genders? It's more than just which app icon you tap, right?
It is, and it's interesting. In the EU, at least, social media use is actually slightly higher among women across pretty much all age groups. But where you really see the difference is which platforms. Our sources suggest women lean toward Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, WhatsApp, Pinterest. Often the focus is more on maintaining social connections, sharing experiences.
So more connection-focused platforms.
Generally, yeah. Whereas men tend to favor platforms like Twitter, LinkedIn, Reddit, Discord, Twitch. Maybe more geared towards sharing opinions, professional networking, or specific interests like gaming. And it's how they're used too. Research suggests men are, generally speaking, more inclined to share opinions, broadcast information. Women, on the other hand, often prioritize keeping those social ties strong. And for girls specifically, there's often more focus on popularity, positive social feedback, which also means negative online interactions can hit them harder compared to boys. Boys, conversely, tend to show a bit more online confidence, maybe more resilience when faced with negative stuff online.
So this isn't just what people like doing online. It sounds like the platforms themselves, the algorithms, might be pushing us further into these patterns.
That's a really key point. Algorithms definitely play a role. Research, like Fuxian Wang's work, shows how this personalization can, maybe unintentionally, limit exposure to different viewpoints. It can end up reinforcing the stereotypes and biases that are already there.
Right, sort of feeling you more of what it thinks you want based on these patterns.
Exactly. And other research found this echo chamber effect can be particularly strong for female users. Seeing similar content constantly can narrow the conversation, reinforce those biases, creates a kind of digital bubble.
It's clear these platforms aren't neutral spaces then, that actively shape things.
Yeah.
But what happens when these subtle algorithmic nudges meet more direct, more hostile stuff online? This is where things get darker, I imagine.
Yeah, unfortunately it does. That TikTok study on gender bias gives a really stark example. Think about this. Searching for female driver on TikTok. The results. Often things like female driver kills someone, Female driver funny video, female driver driving accident.
Seriously, that's what comes up.
That's what the study found. And
Yeah.
the videos, the comments, they often push this stereotype of female drivers as road killers, lots of mocking, even attacks on female physiology. It really shows how societal biases get amplified online. And a big part of this is anonymity. It sort of creates this shield, right? A consequence-free zone for sexism, because often there's no personal connection between the person saying it and the target. The low barrier to posting, maybe weak moderation, it just lowers the risk of expressing these really ingrained biases, leads to what the study called irrational emotional discourse.
That's pretty chilling. So it's not just mean comments. This expands into actual online harm. What does that look like?
It does. The European Parliament has a broad definition for cyber violence against women and girls. It includes cyberbullying, online harassment, sharing intimate images without consent, revenge porn, and cyberstalking. And critically, these online actions have real offline consequences. We're talking severe psychological distress, and sometimes they're even precursors to physical violence.
Wow.
And the data shows girls and women are targeted disproportionately for sexual and gender-based abuse online. Unsolicited, explicit images, being pressured for nudes, images shared without consent, it's disturbingly common.
And does this affect women in public roles differently?
Significantly. Female politicians, journalists, they face much higher rates of online gender-based and sexual abuse compared to men. You can imagine, right? A female journalist might hesitate before publishing a strong piece, knowing the kind of personal gendered attacks she might face.
Yeah.
It leads to self-censorship, silences important voices. It's a real chilling effect on their participation in public life.
And you mentioned other online groups earlier, the manosphere.
Right, the manosphere. It's kind of an umbrella term for various online communities focused on masculinity, often quite critical of feminism. You've got groups like pickup artists, PUAs, teaching techniques like negging, that's giving a backhanded compliment to undermine confidence.
Oh, I've heard of that. Not good.
Not good at all. Then there are MGTOWs, men going their own way, who advocate separating from women. Tradcons, traditional conservatives, often with strong anti-abortion views. And incels, involuntary celibates who blame feminism or women for their lack of sexual relationships. The key thing is how social media lets these extremist ideas spread, find recruits, and sometimes normalize really harmful narratives. Even if platforms like Reddit ban some subreddits, the ideologies often just move elsewhere.
And what about pornography? How did that fit into this picture?
Well, its accessibility today is unprecedented. It's cheap, anonymous, everywhere. There are serious concerns about rising levels of extreme violence against women in even mainstream content. An Irish survey highlighted this. A majority believe porn increases sexual violence and undermines respect for women. And perhaps most worrying is the age of first exposure for boys, often between 8 and 11. That sets incredibly early, often very distorted, ideas about sex and relationships.
That's a lot to take in. Really disturbing stuff. So let's pivot slightly. How does all this digital drama translate into our real lives, our relationships, the expectations we have?
Yeah, it's all connected. That TikTok study talked about media enculturation and market consumption. Basically, the media we consume constantly bombards us with certain images and roles. Think men work outside, women manage the home. Lippmann's ideas about the mimetic environment and stereotypes fit here.
So the media creates this world we see reflected back, and we start to accept it as normal.
Pretty much. It reinforces existing viewpoints. And then there's the female economy. Women control a huge chunk of global spending, maybe 70–80%. So the market targets them, often using female celebrities to create these aspirational images. But this can deepen traditional ideas of female dependence, kind of trapping women in the cycle of trying to consume their way to an ideal while also being consumed by that market.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Which connects perfectly to that viral Reddit discussion you mentioned about the 50-50 relationship idea. What was the main argument there?
The core argument from many women on that thread was this. Splitting finances 50-50 often doesn't translate to an equal split of everything else. They felt it often meant they were carrying a much heavier load, like 80% or even 90% of the domestic chores, the emotional labor, the mental planning for the household.
Right, the invisible work.
Exactly. The question was, if finances are equal, why isn't the rest? And the stats they shared were, well, startling. When a couple marries, apparently a man's total workload, including paid work and chores, decreases slightly by about an hour a week. A woman's increases by 7 hours a week.
7 hours? That's like adding another workday.
It is. And it gets worse with kids, predictably. The anecdotes were telling two partners being condescending about her income if it was lower, using money as control, expecting her to manage everything at home even if she earned more.
And that weaponized incompetence thing.
Yes, pretending not to know how to do basic tasks to get out of them. It led to this recurring, frustrated comment. The bar for men is literally in hell.
Oof, that's blunt.
It reflects a deep frustration. And there are practical reasons women might end up financially dependent too. Childcare costs are astronomical. Over $1,000 a month isn't unusual. Maybe a child has special needs. Maybe there aren't good job opportunities locally, or she has health issues. The discussion really highlighted the difference between equal contributions like splitting bills and equitable contributions, which would have to account for unpaid labor, pregnancy, breastfeeding, things a 50-50 split just ignores.
And that statistic about single mothers living longer.
Yeah, that was a real lightning rod. The statistic cited was that in the U.S., single mothers still live longer than married mothers, which led some in the thread to conclude quite dramatically that heterosexual marriage could be parasitic and literally shorten women's lives. It definitely makes you question the equity in traditional setups.
Wow. That's a heavy thought. Okay, so given all these challenges, online and offline, what are the paths forward? How do we move towards something more equitable?
Well, first, remembering what gender equality actually means. UNICEF defines it as women and men, girls and boys, having the same rights, resources, opportunities, and protections. It's not about being identical.
Right. Equality of opportunity, not necessarily sameness.
Exactly. And this isn't a new fight. You had Christine de Pizan arguing against prejudice back in 1405. The Shakers practiced gender equality way back in the 1700s. And the rise of women in the workforce in the 20th century, as Brookings notes, was fundamental. Today, we see efforts on multiple fronts. Policy-wise, the EU has things like the European Institute for Gender Equality, EIGE, and gender action plans, like GAP3 aiming for concrete changes by 2025 in areas like ending gender-based violence.
So governments setting actual targets.
Yes, and national education systems incorporating these issues too. Health-wise, the UN Population Fund focuses on empowering women through reproductive health access, economic opportunities, education, political participation, importantly, involving men and boys in this. And combating violence specifically, you have international days, declarations like CEDAW, the Istanbul Convention, all trying to build legal frameworks and global pressure.
What about the economic side, beyond just working?
Big challenges remain there. The pink tax, women paying more for similar products, sometimes $1,400 a year extra. Underrepresentation in STEM fields is still a huge issue. The gender pay gap persists, and even things like violations of maternity rights, asking women to sign papers saying they won't get pregnant. It still happens.
Unbelievable.
Politically, you see some interesting experiments, like co-mayorships and quotas in Kurdish regions, aiming for 40% female representation, though they often face pushback. And legally, we forget how recent some changes are. Switzerland only gave married women equal rights in civil law in 1988, the Netherlands in 1984, some U.S. states even later for property rights. And sadly, in some places like Iraq, laws still explicitly allow husbands to punish wives. Shows how deep these structures run.
It really does paint a picture of progress mixed with deeply entrenched problems. But let's bring it back to social media. Can it be part of the solution, despite amplifying some issues?
Absolutely. It has huge potential for good. Think of massive campaigns like #MeToo, the Everyday Sexism Project, UN Women's #Hafersche campaign that reached over 1 billion users.
Huge reach.
Massive. They show social media's power for awareness, mobilization, changing the conversation. And the European Parliament study had concrete recommendations. Better content moderation, real consequences for abuse, regulating targeted ads that might reinforce stereotypes. And the EU's Digital Services Act, the DSA, is a potentially powerful tool here. It aims to make platforms much more accountable for safety and moderation. That's a big step.
So holding platforms accountable, but what about empowering users?
Crucial. We need widespread social media literacy, teaching women and girls especially about unhealthy norms, image manipulation, how things work online. But it's not just for girls. Relationships and sexuality education in schools needs to cover digital consent, online ethics, gender-based violence in ways that resonate with both boys and girls. Starting early. Make it real. Make it relevant.
What a journey we've been on today. From subtle differences in how we use apps to the really dark side of online abuse, through to economic pressures and the long fight for equality, it's so clear the digital world isn't some separate sphere. It mirrors, it magnifies, and it actively shapes our real lives.
Definitely. And understanding these connections, both the problems and the potential, is just essential for navigating the world today. This conversation about gender equality isn't static. It keeps evolving with every new app, every societal shift.
So something for you to think about as you go about your day. How can your interactions online and offline help create a more equitable, more respectful space for everyone? What assumptions maybe could you challenge in how you engage with media or even in your own relationships?